Obviously, with being a police officer, I've run into this type of activity, even in the town that I live in Fort Collins, Colorado. I became aware of it when I was working in a street crimes unit that was really starting to dabble in this and trying to figure out exactly what it is. How do we define it? What does it look like in our community? And I took over that investigative piece of this issue and started collaborating with Dr. Henderson and Megan Lundstrom. And man, it just blew our doors off the things that were happening in our own community. And so it's something that I'm very passionate about since really having an understanding of what it is.
I'm going to poke you a little bit on that story because I'm part of it, I think. What was it? What conversation did you have that really got you to start shifting your perspective as a law enforcement officer away from arresting victims and prostituted people to going after demand?
I feel like you're fishing for a specific example, and I'm trying to pick up what you're laying down there, Angie. And
Didn't you have a conversation with the infamous Megan Lundstrom?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so when we first started doing some of our demand reduction operations, we were figuring out that a lot of the chatting we were doing was a language that we weren't even familiar with. It was a culture that we weren't familiar with. And so I felt the need to reach out to somebody that might be an expert and would be able to train us on what to look for and how to communicate and not to sound like a cop when we're talking to these people. And so, yeah, I had the opportunity to reach out to Megan, hear her story. And most people that get into law enforcement are very compassionate, and I love stories. I love things that happen that make somebody who they are, that they've overcome. And so to hear Megan's story just really, I got buy-in into what this issue is, because I know there's thousands of other Megans out there that I had an opportunity to have an effect in their life and the things that were going on and the things that were happening to them in a negative way. So
that's the part I wanted. See how I had to sort of lure that piece out of him, and that's what we're trying to do.
It's been a really long day.
For me too. Agreed. All right. LMNOPQR. Okay, so Tom, you're next.
Thanks, Angie. I appreciate your leadership in this conversation and just kind of the wider conversation. I came into this work, I've been in it more or less full time for about the last 12 years, began hearing about how it was happening domestically early on. And you know, it's incredibly ironic how many times this story has gotten repeated in men that I've talked to over the years, but we always knew this kind of thing was happening in faraway places, but we never knew it was happening in our own towns. And so I'm an activist by nature. And so when I learned that this was happening, I'm also father of 3 daughters, a youth sport coach, and you know, so we've had a lot of young women in our lives over the years. Anyway, I had to do something, so I did what I typically have done when I am full of passion and zeal and not a lot of insight. I just plowed right into it. And figured if I just showed up and stayed around long enough, I might be able to do some good. I'm grateful that along the way I met people that were patient enough with me and allowed me to kind of grow and evolve over time, kind of shape the work that we do. But I'm in it now. Like I said, been here doing this work with EPIK this is officially our 10th year. Doing this work, so we're celebrating that, and I feel like there's still a whole lot more for me to learn, and a ton more for men to do, and I love that I get to do this work.
You have a ton to learn. You call me at least once a day asking me a new research question. So
I know.
You're always learning.
That's what I'm saying.
All right, save the best for last. Peter, take it away, please.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be with y'all tonight. I'm just so grateful that this is an issue that we're talking about in this way. I got into working on the issue of commercial sexual exploitation about 30 years ago. And I got into doing this work not even knowing this is what I was going to be doing. I started out working on issues of domestic violence. And I was interested in stopping domestic violence because I grew up in a domestic violence household. And I recognized pretty early on that although my father's violence became a problem for my mother and my siblings and myself, that it was really his problem, that it was his inability to deal with perceived criticism, his frustration, anxiety, disappointment, and his feelings of entitlement to take it out sideways on the people around him, on the people who loved him and on the people who he loved. And as I got older, I started to recognize that it wasn't just happening in my house. It was happening in lots of houses. And when it was happening, it was men's violence. Most men don't do these types of things, but most of these types of things are done by men. And so I recognized that that men had a role to play in terms of engaging other men to stop domestic violence. And later, things happened, like my sister came to me and told me she'd been sexually assaulted. Other female and male friends of mine started sharing their sexual abuse as kids with me. And again, I saw that this was a problem with the hearts of men, and that men really needed to be able to engage one another to figure out what our problem was in order to create a more just and compassionate culture. And so I started out working on sexual assault and dating violence, domestic violence. I started out in Portland, Oregon in the late 80s, early 90s, doing sexual assault prevention work and dating violence prevention. Prostitution was off my radar. If you would have asked me at the time, I would have probably said, well, that's a victimless crime, something freely chosen. Who am I to tell somebody else what they should or shouldn't do? And that's about all I thought about it. But a remarkable thing happened. Because of my work on the domestic violence realm, I came across this incredible organization that was active in Portland at the time. They're not there anymore, called the Council for Prostitution Alternatives. And they were a group of survivors that had been in the life, had gotten out, and had started this org to help others. And we're doing amazing advocacy within the DVSA communities especially. And so when I heard them and started to hear their stories, it really flipped my thinking about prostitution on its head. And I started to see, wow, this is really consistent with these other forms of gender-based violence and exploitation. How is it that I had such a blind spot around this? And that began, the unfolding of starting to understand commercial sexual exploitation as a practice of gender-based violence, as a practice of men's violence. And from the outset, I think I just want to say, for my brothers and my trans siblings that are out there that have been exploited in systems of prostitution, that happens. And I don't ever want to minimize that. But if we look at the buyers, those that feel entitled to pay, it's definitely a gender-based violence issue, because it's about the embodiment of male supremacy, really is what it's about. And the sexualization of the subordination of the other. Right, so it happens to women, it happens to men, it happens to boys, but it's still a problem with the hearts of men. And so, fast forward the last 30 years, I've been doing a lot of work. I started one of the first sex buyers intervention programs in the country back in '95. I worked with youth at Youth Care in Seattle. I'm the co-founder of Organization for Prostitution Survivors in Seattle. And then I left Seattle about 2 years ago and landed on the East Coast, and I'm working on a project now called Modeling Equality, which is about consulting, giving technical assistance and training to different municipalities around the country in order for them to adopt policies and practices that are consistent with equality values.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I love how, even I had to poke Rob, but I love how your story had to do with thinking about women's well-being or thinking about survivors' well-being, because one thing that we don't say, well, we say it a lot, but I don't think you can ever say it too much, is listen to survivors. And that's why I had to remind Rob, the law enforcement perspective, I think we could fairly say generally doesn't pull survivors in. Rob, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. I'm sure this is, most of you probably know this, maybe not, but uh, law enforcement is a lot of times really behind the curve when it comes to thinking outside the box of what we've always known and done. Similar to what Peter was saying, I mean, we've looked at prostitution very similarly of, hey, you know, if this is an arrangement between two consenting adults, yes, it's illegal, but we don't look deeper into the issue as, what's going on with this victim, that what's gone on in her life. Is this something that she's doing of her own volition? And even if she is, could she still be a victim of something? So yeah, to look outside the box is really difficult for law enforcement. And Angie and Megan, you guys know that, I mean, we fought really hard in the Northern Colorado area to bring this attention to this issue. And I mean, we were gaining a lot of ground and doing really well, but even still, we still ran into these roadblocks and that sort of thing. And so it's really frustrating on one end because we continue to have that issue um, of people not understanding it despite having us educating them. But I feel like every time we keep doing these types of things and have and the more that we can get out in front of law enforcement leaders or city council leaders, we're just chipping away at that block. And as things happen in society, unfortunately with law enforcement, the times that we change is when we see the need for a change. So if a big case happens, okay, well, look, now hey, something's going on, we need to address this. And it's harder for them to change when we're just trying to educate them without that big um, dramatic moment.
Right.
And so that's the thing that we've been fighting here. I'm kind of getting away from your question there, Angie, but yeah, just wanted to talk about that. Yeah, it's an uphill battle that we've fought and we continue to fight.
Yeah.
We'll see where it goes from here.
Yeah.
Right.
You, yeah, for all the work that you've put in. We've been there, we've seen it, and
We've put in. Yeah, it was a team effort.
So if you joined us for part 1 last week, hopefully you did. If not, the recording is available on our website, theaverycenter.org/webinars. That panel also spoke to guys, and it was 3 survivors. Megan Lundstrom moderated. It was Jamie Johnson and Andrea Hines, who's a Canadian survivor. And that we really designed that webinar in the same spirit as we're doing tonight's, because I think it's really important to always center survivor voices in this fight. And at the same time, I think it's also critical for men to start to understand, and I like to say guys and men sort of interchangeably, and there's a reason I do that. I teach on a college campus, and I don't know if I would call a lot of my male students men yet. They're getting there. So I like to say guys, because I really do feel like we need to move this conversation so far upstream that we're talking about it with teenagers, right? And so how do you think men can get involved? I mean, one of the things that we see in the anti-trafficking space is men get real worked up when they find out about sex trafficking and victimization. So the first step is sort of switching their paradigm to start to see like, wow, maybe this isn't a victimless crime. And then the next step, once they realize the horrors of it, they pick up their metaphorical baseball bat. And Rob, I would love it if you could talk a little bit about what that means for law enforcement, for men and guys to get that angry and to try to do your job for you and sort of go after this issue like renegades.
Yeah, I think some of that old school thought process that we talked about earlier about the way that prostitution is viewed, you can almost add some of this to that. It's just men are used to some degree being rescuers. Like there's that idea that nobody hits a woman, and and I'm going to go out and I'm going to save the day and that sort of thing. Albeit good-hearted, it needs to be channeled in an appropriate way. Because it would be easy for people to take up that charge, but do it ineffectively, do it illegally, and get themselves in trouble, and then they're confused as to why I'm talking to them. and, but the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of really good-hearted people out there, and there's a lot of really good-hearted men out there that really do want to take up the charge. One of the things that we found in the midst of us collaborating together was that we found that a lot of women wanted to help because either with helping with modeling pictures or in doing different things, because they had something happen to them in their lives, or something to somebody they know. And I think it's similar to some of these guys, that if they know they have a female relationship in their life where something has happened to them, then they really feel that, hey, I want to figure out a way to help. I couldn't have helped my sister. I couldn't have helped my whomever, but this is an area where I can actually physically do something. But it's just a matter of being able to balance at aggressive help with how to practically help, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to invite Peter and Tom to reply to that too. So if they aren't supposed to get their baseball bats and their weapons out to try to do Rob's job, what can they do?
Can I speak to that, just as probably the poster child for the guy that Rob is referring to, that was happy to rush in with my baseball bat. I grew up, and this is in our experience has been really common for a lot of our guys. We grew up steeped in that. I call it the warrior kind of mythology, and myth in the sense that it's the stories that we use to kind of define how we see ourselves. And so, I was the guy that was there to protect the women and save the children. Even, I mean, that's a part of our thinking. Yes, I went there.
It's fine.
But I think it comes from that. We buy into that that kind of identity as men, and for me, the change happened when I'm grateful that I guess I had the sense to do this. I listened early, and I think I listened fairly well to survivors, like you were saying, Angie, and I think I was fortunate to be exposed to a lot of those women early on. And what I began to see, hear them say, just from their level of expertise, was that my desire to come in and beat the crap out of guys with my baseball bat. And it wasn't, at times it wasn't a metaphorical one. I wanted it to be a physical one. What I began to hear them say to me was, that's not going to actually solve the problem. In fact, that's an expression of the very problem that creates the problem you think you're trying to solve. So I began to learn that the more I listened to them. And then the other thing I began to see, and I guess this is partly listening, but it's also just paying attention. I began to see the profound strength that survivors demonstrate just in their own lives. And I'm like, they don't need me rescuing them. And that was a huge paradigm shift for me, to see a woman who, to see women who had suffered, and men too, who had suffered and been victimized in ways that are just horrible. But then you see their strength and their resilience, and I'm like, it was a very humbling experience for me to realize I'm not here to rescue them. And they would say that, and it sounded really odd in my ears early on, but I've grown to realize, I'm here to stand with them, to stand next to them. But I think one of the biggest barriers still in the conversation that we're trying to move forward tonight is we still have so many men, young men even, that are being they're being indoctrinated into this kind of warrior mythology that while it may feel good and sound good and make sense, it's actually contributing to the problem. So that's probably one of the biggest paradigm shifts for me on my own journey in this.
Yeah. Peter, what can men do? What do survivors want men to do in this movement?
Well, yeah, this really just breaks my heart because we don't need more men fighting.
No.
There's plenty of men fighting, and you know, it reminds me of the story I told earlier about my sister being sexually assaulted. When she told me about that, and I was, you know, maybe 17, 18 years old at the time, I immediately got really angry and was pretty much yelling at her, who is it? Who did this? Right? And my sister, who I love more than anybody in the world, broke down in tears in front of me and looked at me and said, Peter, this is not about you. This is about me. And I need you to sit down and listen to me. And for me, that was my wake-up call. And that's what it means to be survivor-centered, that this isn't about women owned as property. This isn't about our identities as whoever we want to be as these mythical men. This is really about kind of finding our humanity. And if we're going to do something, we need to be able to heal our way through this. We need to be able to love our way through this with compassion and empathy. We need to not be having these fear-based responses that light up this anger that is just so tired and so 5,000 years ago. You know, we need to take a step into the 21st century and recognize that we can do a lot better than this if we have the courage. If we have the courage to embrace our vulnerability, to embrace our failures, to have resilience, and to listen to those among us who are the most hurt and the most vulnerable, because they're the ones that are going to point out our blind spots. They're the ones who are going to teach us kind of what the work we need to do on ourselves. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the most overt forms of violence that need to be worked on. It's all a continuum. And all of us that grow up in this culture have some work to do, especially those of us that have been raised to be men. And it reminds me, you know, I did a 10-week sex buyers intervention program in Seattle. And we got court mandated guys that came to the class, but we also had self-mandated guys that came to the class. And I remember one guy called and we connected for coffee. He wanted to come to the class, self-refer. And so I sat down with him for coffee. And the first thing he says to me is, you know, Peter, I just want to let you know, I'm a good John. I've never hurt the women physically. I've never hurt them emotionally. And then he stopped himself and he said, well, you know, I'm not really sure if I hurt them emotionally, because when you look in their eyes, it's like they're not even there. It's like they're wearing a mask or something. And so, you know, I looked to him and said, well, what a part about this other person being dissociative told you it was a great time to go ahead and have sex with her. And it reminded me of, I'm not as bad as that other guy over there. I'm not doing the most overt violence. I do these lower level things from these unexamined places within my own self. And so that's okay, because you know, I'm going to be the first one to line up with my baseball bat and take on that Gary Ridgway or that other abusive person. And I see the same thing when people are talking about just the traffickers as being the harmful people, mm-hmm. You know, because this guy who was the good John, right? If that's the good John and he's not harming somebody allegedly because he's not doing overt physical violence there, but if she literally has to leave her body in order to complete this act with him, like that's like dehumanization and subordination and objectification that is the same root that it is that's required for sexualized murder, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and the rest of it. And so I think that being able to, you know, get our own house in order is really what we need to do as men. And then to call one another in, to call other men into accountability on these issues. And it's really easy to call each other out, and men love to call each other out, and we love to compete with each other, and we love to be more together than the next guy on whatever issues we are, but to really be able to come alongside people and call them in to account, I think is the only way that we're really going to change one another and change the culture to a more safe and equitable place for all of us.
100%. 100%. I was talking, so those of you, the students that are on the webinar, you heard me say this in class today. We're learning a new theory. And one of the aspects of the theory was people need to understand how much actual influence they have at the individual level. And I said, I promise you, I'm going to talk about this tonight. And I wish there is so much power in individual conversation. In fact, I would say there's more power in individual interaction with somebody you know and trust than there might be at a macro level, right? So what do those conversations look like? Because if we all agree that yes, there's victimization, there's exploitation, there's dissociation, which, quick book plug, and I know that Tom, Megan and I gave you this reading list, Being and Being Bought. Amazing book. I had my students in my 495, 595 class read it this semester. If we agree that that happens, how do men have these conversations? Should we yell at each other? Should we pull them aside and talk strongly to them? What needs to happen?
I think one of the things we're learning with both our volunteers, but more directly with the buyers that we do get to interact with is.
Can you talk a little bit about what EPIK does first for people who are?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So EPIK, we're a nonprofit, and our lane is engaging male allies to engage sex buyers. That's the shortest version of that. And we've been doing that now, that particular part of our work, for about 7.5 years. So we've talked to a lot of buyers, but what we're learning, and this is new probably within the last couple of years, is the thing that actually engages men more authentically and maybe even more quickly is, and it's similar to what Peter was saying in terms of calling men in, it's just extending an invitation. It's extending an invitation to a guy. And we talk about belonging, and just the desire for humans to belong to some kind of a community is, I think it's a universal trait in people's hearts. And so we're learning to kind of come from that posture when we talk to guys, which is dramatically different from where we started. And we're finding more and more as our guys are getting kind of more acclimated to that new approach, that it actually does work. So, and it feels really counterintuitive. And at the same time, it's a really human thing. When someone authentically engages you and wants to know you, that's a really powerful force. Like what Peter says, it draws you towards someone. And so we're learning to use that kind of an approach, and it's not a gimmick. It's something that we believe in. But we're extending invitations to buyers to talk about belonging and what are the deeper needs that are driving sex buying, and trying to tap into that nerve a little bit. And then just among our volunteers, it's a similar conversation, and it's creating a really strong, I think, really healthy camaraderie amongst our guys. And what's unique and really, I think, meaningful about it is it's not just we're not just guys, but there are women that are a part of these conversations too. There are people within our network, Angie, Megan, people like that, are part of those conversations, and I think it's really healthy and life-giving.
So you're in 14 cities now, 15 across the US?
I'll say 14. I think that was the latest count. Yeah.
And what I've seen happen since I've gotten to know y'all at EPIK Project is it's not necessarily about, okay, we're going to disrupt this many, we're going to get this guy to not buy sex. We're going to do that 25 times a night. What I've seen is in our conversations, it shift from, no, actually, we want to change the way that our volunteers think about belonging, think about their own stories, and how to be, for lack of a better term, I guess, vulnerable. And I think that's happened, and I think that's become a stronger part of your mission over the past couple of years, at least since I've known you.
Yeah, and that progression is exactly what what I've gone through. I think all of our core guys have gone through. We started out by saying, all right, well, let's disrupt the Commercial Sex Act. Let's figure out how to disrupt the transaction. And we figured out how to do that pretty effectively. But along the way, and this was actually, this began to surface from our volunteers. They, night after night, they're talking to, all these guys, and they're going, hey, there's a deeper conversation here. What's what is it about our culture that is making these men feel entitled to do this? And so we realized we've got to figure out a way to disrupt the narrative around masculinity. And then the third level, and our Brian Rossi, who is our program manager,
He's on there. He's on there.
Is he on? Okay, so I'm going to give him some credit. We call this the Rossi paradigm. This third level of disruption is a disruption in our own sense of what it means to be a man, and really rethinking masculinity. And I think for younger guys, maybe that's easier. I'm 60 years old, and it took me a long time to rethink and maybe rewire some of that thinking in my own mind. But there's this really personal, deep disruption that happened, and all of our guys eventually will go through that.
Mm-hmm. So you've got volunteers engaged. Let's shift, Peter, if you don't mind, to talking about the actual buyers. Are they the monsters that people with those baseball bats make them out to be? And the example that you just gave made my skin crawl. But what's really going on here, and what do we actually need to address, maybe on an individual sort of buyer, John School, or, what we call it in Fort Collins is the First Offender Restoration Initiative. So the focus is on restoring them.
Yeah, that's a big question. And it's a big question because, people often turn to me and say, well, what do we do with these buyers? And I think it's a mistake to just look at it as the buyer's problem. The buyer definitely has a problem as an individual, but if we look at like how many buyers are arrested in the first place and how many end up in any sort of sex buyers program, it's just such a minuscule percentage. I mean, in Seattle, we get about 200 men a year coming through the SSE class. When we did some research a few years back, we estimated that there were 6,000 men in a 24-hour period looking to buy sex on just one website in Seattle, in King County. And so if you think, okay, and so we get 200 of them a year coming through this class, we need to go way upstream. So we need to do the work that you were talking about, Angie, with the prevention work in middle schools and high schools, certainly. But they can't also just be like one-off presentations where we go in, and meanwhile they have teachers and other staff members who are just co-creating a culture there where women are systematically devalued, and there's homophobia and the rest of it, like that. So you need to change the culture. You need to work with the staff and the teachers as much as you do with the students to change the culture. Mm-hmm. And then even getting, elementary schools, like one of the greatest programs was, Tom and I know Bianca out in San Diego. And when we were thinking of interventions to do along kind of a spectrum of prevention work, work with fourth grade boys on social emotional learning. Yeah. Like that would do a lot to stop not just future sex buying, but future dating violence, domestic violence, bullying, so I think that that we need to look at the problem in a holistic way. And now that said, I think also sex buyers programs are really important to have as well, because I think that there's a lot we can learn from them. And when I'm doing, presentations and trainings, and just like that story I shared earlier about the sex buyer, when you're able to kind of like have those stories and come to people and talk about what this actually is, what the practice of buying sex is about, and how it's problematic, how problematic it is, and how it stems from this bigger issue in culture about what men learn about sex and sexuality. Most men learn from a pretty young age that we can get our relational needs met through non-relational sex. Yeah. And unfortunately or fortunately, that is never going to happen, right? That in order to meet relational needs, you need to be relational.
Right, I was going to say.
It needs to be intersubjective. It can't be about the objectification and dehumanization of this other person, and this eroticism that's based on dominance, which requires the subordination of the other. If we're talking about mutuality and people really kind of getting together in a way that's significant and really connected and intimate, then that's kind of like where we need to make the switch. And so when I started doing the work, in my mid-20s, back in the 90s was when I started working with sex buyers. And at that point, I was learning from survivors that this was horrible. And I was learning that it was harmful, and I was learning it was hurtful, and I didn't know what to say. But I knew that there were men that were starting to get arrested because of the advocacy that we were doing. And I knew that I had been doing some work in batters intervention, and that I wanted to create a similar sort of intervention program for them. And so just like Tom said, I just started doing it, and pretty much found myself standing in front of these groups of men saying, knock it off, you're hurting women, like, which wasn't right, wasn't so effective. And, in a lot of ways at that point, I feel like I was like talking to my father saying, stop hurting mom,
Sure.
And now I really feel like I'm talking to myself, right? And with a lot more of the same sense of accountability to people who are harmed, but with a much greater sense of compassion for the experience of the buyer as well,
Yeah.
with a full knowledge that he's done some horrible things, right? And that it's going to be a different guy that shows up in my class than shows up in a car on a date, or shows up in a hotel. Like, it's a different guy that shows up in my class. It's a different guy that goes home to his wife than it is who shows up with the person in prostitution. And that is one of the reasons why whenever I talk to people who are working with sex buyers, you need to also be listening and talking and working with those who have been exploited, because they're the ones that have the inside knowledge of what it is like to be on the other end of this experience, right? And so it's to them we're accountable to. Right. And I think that's one of the things I hear often when men have accountability groups or whatever, is that they are accountable to other men in their group. And it just like, that boggles my mind. It's like, no, that's not what accountability is about. Like, a social justice accountability, certainly we call one another to account, but ultimately we are accountable to those who have the lived experience and understand the things that we can't. Right. And so I think that working with buyers is, to get back to your question, is it's an impossible job. A lot of them aren't going to change. If they do change, it's going to be in really small ways. And you can't think of it as not being successful if you don't get everybody to change. But you got to think of it as being kind of embedded in this much larger project that's about kind of working across this spectrum of prevention and across multiple levels of social ecology in multiple different sectors in order to create change, right? So it's not just like turning our attention from the person in prostitution and saying, oh no, this is the wrong person, we need to look over here. Yeah, we need to look over here, and we need to take a look at that this person didn't come from nowhere. This person like came from a culture and a society and relationships that helped mold him into a person who looked out there and felt entitled to behave in this way, and actually saw this as something that he could do. And so the change project is much bigger than the individual. And we could talk a lot more about the individual. I know I'm using up a lot of time, but I think that's not the really important part of it.
Yeah.
In fact, which sounds crazy coming from somebody who works, has done all this work with sex buyers. But I think that it's just a small but important part.
Right. And I 100% agree. Like when I teach my classes, I talk about who is involved in a commercial sex act. There's the victim potentially, potentially a victim. I don't want to make the claim that all individuals involved in prostitution are victims. There's the trafficker who got her there, or the pimp, if that's the situation. And there's always a buyer. And Megan has an economic model, an economic presentation that she gives, and she gives it at John School. Rob and I have seen it probably 100 times. And I pay attention every single time because it's so true. Unless you stop the demand for the quote unquote product, and I realize it's a crude way to put it, but I'm going to blame Megan. She's a survivor and it's her words, right? So unless you stop the demand for that product, it's never going to go away. Right. Yeah. And to back up farther, right, you're talking about the social ecological model. I mean, there's the individual at the center of that model. And then we talk about the social institutions surrounding them. And you got to back all the way up into culture, because which cultures does this flourish in? In cultures where there's gender inequality, where there's patriarchy, where there's racism, there's homophobia, like all of those places, all of those things that are incredibly unhealthy. right? And so you cannot just look at it, I don't think, at the individual level. It's got to be all of it. That being said, I kind of want to pick Rob's brain, because when you said, Peter, the guy that shows up to John school isn't the guy that shows up to the date. Rob has seen them both. He's been the guy that's arrested these guys. And also, Rob speaks at our John school in Fort Collins. So Rob, do you want to comment on sort of what you see in that spectrum of interactions? Please.
Yeah. That was the one thing that I was a little taken aback by after kind of starting to learn this about this problem. In my mind, my pendulum had swung from, this is a victimless crime. It's, that business arrangement, to all these guys are evil, bastards, and we should, take them all to jail, and I hope they resist. I'm kidding. But I was taken aback by, I mean, we've arrested hundreds of men in these ops, and they tend to be humble. They tend to, I mean, they were not this, demon that I had pictured in my mind. And I was really taken aback by, and when I mean humble, I don't mean, what's a better way of describing that? Just
Scared.
Reserved. There are people that you would go to church with. There are people that you work with. I mean, we had high school coaches, we had CEOs, we had pastors, we had college students. And so in my mind, I'm trying to wrap around, because I was usually the guy that was talking to these people when they were responding to the ads. And I heard all the things that they were saying they wanted to do. And I mean, just this fantasy that they had laid out to me, thinking that I was going to meet up with them. And then seeing this guy, who's older, coming in and just not connecting with the person I was talking to. So kind of along the lines of what these guys were talking about, and what you had mentioned earlier about how do we start, there is that sense of accountability that every man needs to have. And it's that warrior thing that we were talking, that Tom was talking about earlier. It would be easy for us to get into that warrior mindset of, yep, you know what, we're going to go out, we're going to figure out how to hold men accountable, we're going to train them, we're going to teach them. Truth of the matter is, it starts right here. Yeah. It starts with me. Mm-hmm. And I have to know what things are affecting me. Like, does pornography affect me in a negative way? And I'm not going to get into the whole discussion of is pornography, hey, it's America, it's my right to watch it, does it objectify women? But I can tell you in my experience, and I know you researchers don't like 100% certainty, so I'm going to say 99.9% of the men that we reached out, that we had arrested, had a pornography addiction.
It's 100%. On all the John schools that we've gathered data at, which is not as extensive as Peter, but yeah, they all have a pornography addiction.
Right. And so then we go back to, okay, well, what's wrong with that person? Where did they get off track? Do we, go into the fourth graders, like Peter was talking about, and connecting with them and trying to teach them, like, what's healthy? What is a healthy man? What does that look like? But again, I come back to that self accountability. I come back to being a father and being aware of what my kids are watching on their phones. My son, to some degree, we've gotten into this idea of parenthood where, well, it's my child's right to have a phone at 13 years old. And then at 13 years old, well, you know what? I don't really feel like I have the right to look at what they're doing. It's their privacy. I'm interrupting their privacy. Well, no, you're still their parent, and you still need to know what's going on. And so again, that accountability personally, but within your family. And then it's almost like one of those multi-level marketing things. Hey, you start affecting what you have control over, yourself, and then maybe your children, and that sort of thing. Then hopefully then that will spread out and help change the culture from more of a grassroots level like that.
Rob, it's almost like you remembered the title of this webinar, shifting the conversation from I have daughters to I have sons. And really, and I was just going to bring that up, but you got there before me, and not just I have sons, but I have friends. I mean, there's college students on this webinar, and my sons have friends. So I'm worried about my sons. Yes, absolutely. But I'm more worried about everybody, right?
You wouldn't believe a lot of the calls that we go to. We actually just had a call here in Fort Collins earlier this week where a teenage boy shot another teenage boy, and the core of it, when you finally get to the meat of it, I can't talk about it because it's an open investigation, but it had to do with how one male treated another teenager because he thought that's what was appropriate because of what he had seen on like on Pornhub or whatever website he was going to. And it had just devolved into this fight between two teenage boys, and the one boy ended up shooting the other boy. And it's like, oh my gosh, like what world do we live in, that this is reality to them, that how you treat a woman based on what you're looking at on a pornographic website is reality. It's just not reality, and it's unfortunate. But how do you change that? How do you start changing that culture?
We can.
Absolutely, we can.
I have hope. We've got a couple of questions. I want to make sure that they get answered because I know, like I said at the beginning, that there are folks on here who have maybe not a ton of background knowledge about sex trafficking outside of the times that I just talk about it in class. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and whoever wants to answer it can. What types of things would you say to those that don't see prostitutes as victims, as in those who strongly believe in the notion that women who sell sex do so by choice? I wish there were some survivors here to answer that question, but Tom, you look interested in answering that question.
No, I was laughing because my only answer to that would be, let me give you a list of survivors. I have their cell phone numbers. Why don't you call them and ask them that question? There's a lot of myths that we encounter like that when we're talking to buyers. I don't know if I have like a really slick canned answer to that.
I can quote. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I can quote the amazing Val Ritchie by saying, and I would have invited him, but it's like the middle of the night in Austria right now. But he, in his presentation that he did for World Without Exploitation this summer, he talked about the immense racial and clear gender inequality between the buyer and the prostituted person, right? We know, and this is based on the data in Seattle and just in King County, but I know that we can replicate these things and find it to be true elsewhere. Megan and I just got done with my amazing graduate research assistant, McKenna, looking at the racial difference on sugaring sites between the buyers and those who are sugaring, which don't even get me started on that. It's predominantly white, privileged, educated, wealthy men who have steady jobs victimizing people of color who are marginalized, who have trauma in their backgrounds and have any number of vulnerabilities. So when we look at those statistics, how is it truly a choice? Peter?
Yeah, just building off what you're saying too. I think that at best we need to look at sex buying as a form of sexual misconduct, and it exists, sex buying, right? That oftentimes we want to turn around and pivot back and say, well, is this a choice for her? Well, honestly, that's a red herring. Anything any of us do or do not do is a choice. And this is a conversation I have with the sex buyers the first night of class. When they come in and say, well, some people choose to do this. And then I say, well, everything we do or do not do is a choice. For instance, you all, to this group of court-mandated sex buyers, chose to come to this court-mandated sex buying class. And they push back and say, oh no, we didn't choose to do this. And so then I break it down for them and say, okay, so you looked at it and you said, I have to go to this class because the other option is that this person with more power than me told me I have to go to this class, so there's going to be negative consequences. So I looked at it and I saw I had a bad choice and a worse choice. And that's kind of what the reality of most people who are in systems of commercial sexual exploitation is about, is in a lack of choices, a lack of awareness of other alternative options. And it's the less shitty choice that you can see at the moment. But what we need to do is pivot and look to the buyer, and the choice is an agency of that buyer, right? Because the buyer is making a clear choice, and that choice is an abuse of power. And if I've learned anything in the last few years of the Me Too movement, it's that sexual activity should never be a condition of employment. And if sexual activity should never be a condition of employment, it should never be in a condition of employment. And it's simply not okay to say, no, not to this upper class woman, professional woman in the workplace, but that poor youth of color on the street over there. Yeah, do it to her. Nobody's going to miss her. Well, we miss her and we want her back. And we are going to hold to account those that feel entitled to exploit their power and their privilege in this way. You know, so I think that the reframe of the choice question has to be put back on those who have the power to determine whether these systems of exploitation, selfishness, and cruelty are going to continue or are not. And so I think that like being able to look at the person who actually is not just driving trafficking, but is abusing his power, right, by demanding sexual access to the body of another person who doesn't want to have sex with him. Like why don't we wrap our heads around that fundamental? If you know, and this is coming from a person who started out doing sexual assault prevention, right? I couldn't imagine going out to talk to young men and say, oh, make sure that it's mutual, that there's a yes without fear or confusion, an enthusiastic yes. Oh, unless you're paying. And if you're paying, then different rules apply. Right. Like if consent and mutuality are important to have to make sure that sexual activity is consensual, then that needs to happen across the board, right? So I think that changing the conversation about the choice of the person who's exploited towards the choice and power of the exploiter is a way to kind of like take another look at this situation in a way that we don't normally see.
100%. And I see other questions popping up in the Q&A. And Meredith, you are so amazing. I wish that you were in my Global Perspectives of Prostitution class this semester. So we'll have that conversation at another time. I will absolutely answer that question for you. But Chris, who's a guy who's interested in being involved in our EPIK branch here in Northern Colorado, is claiming an addiction to pornography away from men to avoid accountability. I think this takes us back a couple of pieces of conversation. And I think what he's trying to say here is, do men say, well, I was addicted to porn, as a way to just be like, well, this was the logical next step, and not really look deeply inside themselves as to what's actually going on and what created that pornography addiction in the first place?
I'll answer that just briefly. Peter's had more of those kinds of conversations, I think, but I don't know that we've encountered a lot of men that play that card as a way of explaining their behavior. That seems like something they don't necessarily want to see exposed, at least in the exchanges that we have. It's a different context than than in some kind of a diversion program. But we don't, I hear people using that term to describe the condition of those men. And I'm not convinced that sexual addiction is the driving force for everybody. If it's truly an addiction, then it probably needs to be diagnosed properly by someone who has the expertise to do that. So I tend to shy away from throwing that idea of addiction around. But the other side of it is we're immersed in a pornographic culture. We're raised in a pornographic culture from early on. So everybody is exposed and influenced by it to some degree or another. But I don't hear guys necessarily, at least when we're having those conversations, using that as an excuse for why they're buying sex.
But perhaps the cultural norm that sexual objectification is normal. Maybe that would be an excuse, perhaps.
I think the pornography conditions them to think that what they are doing is okay.
Sure.
That's just the way we were raised. Yeah.
It's a really complicated question. Like definitely there's kind of physical compulsive aspects of all of this, but it also happens within this cultural context. And I do think that oftentimes, you know, I used to hear, quite honestly, from wives of the buyers, and who would tell me, oh, he says he has a sex addiction. You know, which was to me an accountability dodge in a lot of ways, right? A way to and maybe it was a compulsive sort of thing, but I think you need to look a little bit deeper than that. And if it was a compulsive sort of behavior, an addictive sort of behavior, take a look at why that behavior, why target that particular class of person in prostitution, why act out in this particular context, because those are all choices, right? That the buyer is making. And so I think that it's really simplistic to just say that, and even folks that work, you know, with people that they identify as sex addicts would say about 1 in 6 men who buy sex have a compulsive or addictive relationship with sex. So yeah, I think sometimes it's a dodge. I think sometimes there's a lot of truth in it. And I do think that there are a lot of folks that I know that have gotten a lot of help from kind of 12-step programs around kind of like their own unhealthy sexual behaviors. And so, you know, I think if that works for them, that's great. But I think also doing some other forms of therapy and some other forms of kind of self-exploration to figure out where this behavior comes from, and some work beyond yourself, right? I think one big component of the class that we did in Seattle that I'm training folks around the country to do now, on the last night, I introduced to them the social ecological model.
Yes.
Right? And locate and ask them, because, you know, it's great if they never buy sex again, but my expectation is that now that they kind of have this greater understanding of what the problem is, what the societal problem is, that they're going to be able to leverage their relationships to be able to work with the individuals in their lives, to work in the broader communities and with the institutions, and in order to kind of have a greater impact with us together. Because I think that oftentimes this behavior does get pathologized,
Sure.
right? And that we look at that, oh, this is his sickness or whatever, rather than this is a bad behavior and a really bad habit that he got into because of problems, his problems. And rather than have the resilience and be able to grieve his way through his problems and have the feelings that he needed to negotiate his way through that, he couldn't deal with his shit. So he amplifies it and projects it onto somebody else in a sexualized way, you know, in ways that culturally are appropriate for a man to behave in, right? And so I think that bigger like understanding of it as a cultural problem requires us to co-create culture, an alternative culture that values mutuality, respect, and equality. So that's the invitation, right, towards change.
Mm-hmm. And go ahead.
I was just going to add, if we let people not let them off the hook, but if we let them play the sexual addiction card, then the problem is them. It's not the culture that they're a part of, and I think it makes it easy for us to not look at the deeper issues that are required and the cultural change that's necessary while they're just sex addicts.
That's That's a great segue into what I was just actually about to say. So speaking of the social ecological model, and I bet all of my theory students on here are like, why haven't you taught us this? I teach it in a different theory class. But I'm so curious as a sociologist, and I'm not a social movement scholar, but I'm so curious about the confluence of Me Too, the Me Too movement, the racial unrest that we're seeing. And given that we see so much, you know, privileged white men buying Black and brown bodies, and like the election season and Epstein and all of that, is now a good time to raise those voices, to elevate the voices of folks and try to get individuals to understand and reframe the way that we think about exploitation of bodies? Because I see the confluence of those things, but I'm curious as men, because one of the things I tell my students all the time is it's okay for people who are sort of on the bottom of, marginalized individuals to fight and to protest and to do all of these amazing things. But unless people at the top are listening, it's going to be hard to effectuate any sort of change. And we know that men have power in society. So is now a good time to be thinking about and pushing these agendas forward?
I think now is the right time, but I'm nervous about our readiness as a culture of men to do it the right way.
Mm.
My fear is we would just, I think, just kind of get back in that warrior mythology rut, and it becomes a conversation about calling men to protect our women, kind of right back to where we were a while ago. It takes a lot of effort and energy and commitment for men to think deeply about the things that we're talking about here, right? I don't know a lot of guys. Well, I know more now than I did, 10 years ago, that would be willing to have this kind of a conversation. But I mean, it's always the right time to speak, but I think we have to be careful that what we're saying, that we're saying it the right way, in the right spirit, with the right posture, and maybe we should speak a little bit less. Maybe I'm contradicting myself here, but maybe we should not speak and serve in some way, in a way that I don't know.
Rob,
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer because of exactly what you're talking about, Tom, that these things tend to take a life of their own. Anytime you have, can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Everything froze there for a second. Is that these things take a life of their own, and then they get distorted and changed and perverted as they grow and grow. And so, yes, we need to have those conversations. And like Thomas said, it has to be done very judiciously and very intelligently. But even if you go through those great pains of trying to accomplish that, my fear is that it would still take on that life of its own and change into something that that isn't what it's meant to be. What I'm thinking in my mind, and a kind of I guess an example of what I'm talking about, is human trafficking has gained a lot of momentum over the last few years. And if any of you guys are on, Facebook or Instagram and that sort of thing, you will see people post things about, hey, I had this experience at the grocery store where somebody left a note on my windshield wiper, or hey, I was invited to this women's prayer group. And so that it takes on this life, and for us as law enforcement, we start getting inundated with these type of calls. That one about the women's prayer group is an actual example that we had, and I spent more time debunking the myth. I did my research. I made sure that there was no calls that I could find in our area in the state of Colorado. And then I did a search nationwide as well. And I couldn't find anything where this had actually happened. But this story about this women's prayer group had gotten national attention. There was actually national articles about this thing. And so instead of me focusing on actually fighting this crime, going after pimps and traffickers and things of that nature, instead I'm spending so much time calling people that are, calling the police department and being like, hey, what are you doing about this? This is ridiculous. You guys need to take care of this in our city. I can't believe it's going on. And we're like, it's not really happening.
Yeah.
So back to what Tom was talking about, I agree. It's really hard to know where to go from that. Do you make it a big thing where you're educating and you're getting it out there and it's a big movement, but then you risk it getting distorted into all these different little pockets? Or do you do what Tom was saying and just serve and just have it be almost like an underground, hey, we're going to handle our business. It doesn't need to be anything that's, that captures media attention or anything like that, but we're going to focus on just what is in our span of control, and then we're going to affect it from down here up instead of like from up here down, if that makes some sense.
Yeah. I think we can do both. I think if we make it about violence, gender-based violence, which it is, violence against women and bodies of color, people are worked up about that stuff right now, and we leave out the piece that it's about like trafficking. I mean, we don't have to leave it out, but make it about equality and about gender-based and racial-based violence.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe I'm crazy, Peter.
I don't think you're crazy. I think that being able to connect all the dots, like, and be able to talk about structural inequality and systems change, that we're looking at all of these intersecting systems of oppression, right? And we need to be able to figure out kind of like how we can make the changes in the way we are to address those problems. And that really is rooted in kind of a value of equality. And I think being able to talk about equality values and what they are, not in a moralistic sense, but in in a philosophical sense about kind of how do we co-create culture that we can share together, right? And how do we do this in a way where we recognize that we need each other and that actually like we can work through difficulties and we don't have to fight with each other all the time. And that's, you know, that we're not gonna be able to really take on these problems unless we make some real fundamental shifts in the way that we value things. There's a great quote from Oscar Wilde, and Oscar Wilde said that the definition of a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And I think that we live in really cynical times, right? And we live in selfish times. And one other exercise I do with the sex buyers is to ask them what they value. And they put up the same things on the whiteboard that this group would put up on the whiteboard. They value their relationships, they value their time, they value their children, they value their friends. Like and so I think that once we get through our heads that we can co-create what Dr. King called the beloved community, right? People who are kind of working together to create a world of equality where everyone is valued and everyone's allowed. Then that's kind of like when we're having success. So I think it's a broad change that needs to happen. And I think that you're right, Angie. I think that there's a lot of pieces right there. Unfortunately, I think commercial sexual exploitation gets siloed off. Yeah. Sometimes. Actually, it's not even commercial sexual exploitation because people conceptualize the problem as trafficking, which is a whole nother conversation that I know we don't have time for. But I think that you're right. I think that this is a really ripe moment historically to be able to really address the roots of this problem.
Yeah, I have hope. Do you guys have hope? Rob is a cynic. Any final closing thoughts? I know we had like an hour 15 minutes set aside for this, and I know it's getting late, Peter, East Coast time. Any final thoughts? And keep in mind, we've got a lot of college students on this call, and I tell them all the time, I believe in you all. Like, you are watching some crazy historical stuff happen right now. And even my kids, it's so interesting because my kids are 8, 12, and 15, and they're like, who won the election? What are the results? And they understand the Electoral College. And I'm like, are they going to be civically engaged their whole lives? Because I guess for that, I should be thankful. But any final parting thoughts for our upstream college students and everybody else? I don't want to ignore everybody else, but I'm like a protective mama bear of my college students. Anything you want to say?
Angie, I would say anybody that's been in this work for any length of time has gotten the question, well, what do I do to, keep my daughter safe? And it's always, and I think what we need to be ready to say is, well, let's talk about how we raise safe sons who grow up into be, safe men who demonstrate, things like humility and empathy and men who recognize that they have strength, but so do women. And it's not about, it's not about wielding power. It's about giving away the strength that you have so that other people can flourish. And I think that's where we need to redirect the conversation. So it's not about keeping our daughters safe. I mean, that's a concern, but that doesn't solve the problem.
The inspiration, maybe.
Yeah, it is it's the thing. Well, it's the thing that propelled me into this work, And I don't think that's a bad starting place. But if you get stuck, if you stay there, you're never going to actually make any difference. So.
do we want to end on that? Rob, do you have any final parting brilliant words? Because
Can I ask-
I know Peter does.
Can I ask Rob a question though?
Yeah.
It would be really cool if you told us right now that you've been on a stakeout this whole time. Is that true?
No, man, it's been a long day. I wish I could give you something cool like that, but you know, I'm sitting at the bottom of the mountain ready to go up. I didn't want to lose reception, so.
Thank you for sitting on the side of the road for us, Rob.
Absolutely. I wouldn't have missed this.
I owe you a coffee.
Sounds good. I'll take you up on it.
Awesome. Peter, it's late, I know. What do you want to say to my college students?
Oh, just keep on keeping on. You know, keep learning about this stuff. My email is really easy, peter@modelingequality.org. And so if you want to reach out, if any of this stuff you have any questions about or wanted to have a conversation about, want to make myself available to talk more about it, because there's lots of things that each of us can do and a lot of creative stuff that only you can do. Right. And so welcome.
Yeah. Glad to have you. All right, folks.
And real quick, I just put my email on there as well. If anyone has questions just from a law enforcement side or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me there. Happy to answer any questions that I can.
And also I'll give any students extra credit for emailing Rob about zip ties that were on their car handles and their windshield wipers. Don't do that. He's in Larimer County, so maybe you guys are off the hook. All right, folks, thank you again so much. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but Angie, I know you, and Meredith, I know you, so I will get with you and answer those questions for you. Thank you so much for joining us. The recording will be available on our website in the next few days. Round of applause for our guys. Thanks so much for being here tonight.
Data.
Good night.
Bye.